morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting its golden glow across the room, but Peter's heart was cold with realization. Victoria's smile, once so warm, now seemed a mask, her every word a practiced lie. He thought about the late nights, the suspicious texts, the way her gaze would flit away when he asked a simple question. The truth he had been avoiding hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't paranoia. This was betrayal. He looked across the table, his voice trembling but resolute. "You've been lying to me, to us, and I'm done pretending I don't see it." Victoria froze, her fork hovering midair, her face unreadable. The silence between them stretched, heavy and electric. Peter's heart pounded as he braced for the confrontation that would change everything. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this tale, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any future updates. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting a golden glow over the polished counters and gleaming appliances. The smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of the radio playing an old jazz tune. Peter sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a warm mug. It was a picture-perfect scene of domestic bliss, the kind he had once dreamed of. Victoria moved gracefully around the kitchen, her silk robe flowing behind her. She placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of him, offering a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Peter studied her face, his heart heavy with something he couldn't yet name. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but quiet. She responded with a quick nod, already distracted by her phone. Her fingers moved rapidly over the screen, the faint sound of her typing cutting through the comfortable silence. Peter took a bite of toast, the crunch echoing louder than he expected. He glanced at her again, hoping for a moment of connection. She didn't look up. "Busy day ahead?" he ventured. "Oh yeah," she replied absently. "Meetings, lots of them." "Wait." He nodded and returned his gaze to his plate. There was no warmth in her tone, no effort to elaborate. The ease they once shared had been replaced by something distant, almost mechanical. He sipped his coffee, the bitterness matching the taste in his mouth. The children's laughter broke through the silence as they barreled into the room, their energy filling the space. Victoria's face lit up for the first time that morning as she greeted them. Peter watched, a faint smile tugging at his lips. For a moment, everything felt normal. But as Victoria kissed the children goodbye and headed out the door, her briefcase in hand, Peter felt the hollowness return. He lingered in the kitchen, staring at her untouched coffee cup. The sun shone brighter now, but Peter felt the shadow of something unspoken between them, growing longer. The living room buzzed with the sounds of conversation and clinking glasses. Peter sat on the couch, his hands resting on his knees, trying to find his place among the lively crowd. Victoria's family filled the room, their laughter loud and boisterous. They always seemed larger than life, commanding attention in a way that often left Peter feeling small. Victoria stood near the fireplace, her glass of wine catching the light as she laughed at a story her brother-in-law, Kevin, was telling. She looked radiant, confident. Peter couldn't help but admire her from a distance, even as he felt like an outsider in the midst of her world. "Peter, you're so quiet," Kevin's voice cut through the chatter, drawing everyone's attention to him. "Still shy after all these years?" The group chuckled, and Peter forced a polite smile. "Just listening," he replied. "Oh, come on," Kevin pressed, leaning forward with a grin that didn't quite feel friendly. "What's the most embarrassing thing you've ever done? Let's hear it." Peter hesitated, the heat rising to his face. "I'm not sure I—" "Remember that time at the barbecue?" Victoria interrupted, her voice teasing. Peter tripped and fell into the pool fully clothed. It was hilarious. The room erupted in laughter, and Peter tried to join in, but it felt forced. He glanced at Victoria, hoping for a look of reassurance, but she was too busy reliving the moment with her family. "Good times," Kevin said, clapping Peter on the back. The force of it nearly made him spill his drink. Peter's smile faltered. He stared down at the carpet, his fingers tightening around his glass. The laughter echoed in his ears, louder than it should have been. He told himself it was just a joke, just their way of bonding, but the ache in his chest told a different story. Later, as the guests dispersed and the house quieted, Peter and Victoria stood in the kitchen. He gathered the courage to speak. "You didn't have to bring that up, you know." "Oh, Peter," she said, rolling her eyes. "Don't be so sensitive." "It was funny. Maybe to you," he replied softly. She sighed and turned away, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. "You're overthinking it." Peter didn't argue. He stood there in the silence, the faint sound of laughter still ringing in his ears. That evening, after the last of the guests had left, the house fell silent. Peter leaned against the kitchen counter, watching Victoria rinse wine glasses with an air of satisfaction. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "Why do they always have to make me the punchline?" His voice was calm, but carried a weight that made Victoria pause. She glanced at him briefly before returning to the sink. "Oh, come on, Peter, it's just harmless fun." He pushed off the counter, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Harmless fun? It doesn't feel that way. It's always me, always at my expense." Victoria sighed and turned to face him, her expression a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. "You're taking this way too seriously." Peter held her gaze, his tone steady but firm. "I'm telling you, Victoria, this laughter will cost us one day. You think it's just a joke, but it chips away at things, at respect, at trust." She rolled her eyes, grabbing a towel to dry her hands. "You're being dramatic." "No," he said, shaking his head. "I'm being honest. You don't see it now, but one day, this will matter. Exercising increases the bliss profile, so it also increases insula. Then," Victoria dismissed his words with a quick shake of her head and a short laugh. "You're overthinking again. Maybe that's why they tease you." The sting of her comment hit harder than he expected. Peter didn't reply, letting the silence speak for him. She brushed past him, her heels clicking against the tiled floor as she disappeared into the living room, leaving Peter alone with his thoughts. In the weeks that followed, Peter noticed a shift in Victoria's behavior. At first it was subtle, an extra hour spent out running errands or a late return from the office. But soon the changes became harder to ignore. One evening, she came home, hours later than expected, her heels clicking hurriedly on the floor as she entered. Peter was waiting in the living room, his book lying unread on his lap. "Work ran late?" he asked casually, though the edge in his voice betrayed him. Victoria set her purse on the counter and slipped off her coat. "Yeah, it's been crazy at the office lately." Peter nodded, pretending to accept her explanation. But as the days turned into weeks, the excuses piled up, each one less convincing than the last. Then there were the expenses. Peter discovered them while paying the credit card bill, high-end boutiques he knew she hadn't mentioned, and restaurants they hadn't visited together. At first he thought it might have been a mistake, but when he asked her, she waved it off with a quick, "Oh, I picked up a gift for a colleague," or "The girls wanted to try out a new place." The pattern gnawed at him. It wasn't just the money. It was the way her answers came too quickly, too neatly packaged. Her phone was always just out of his reach when it buzzed, and her laughter, once a warm sound that filled the house, now seemed distant and guarded. One night, as she gathered her things for another late meeting, Peter leaned against the doorframe and watched her. "You're out a lot these days," he said, his tone neutral but probing. Victoria glanced at him in the mirror as she adjusted her earrings. "It's work, Peter. You know that." He nodded slowly. I do, but it doesn't feel like it." She stiffened but didn't turn around. "I don't have time for this," she said, grabbing her bag and heading for the door. As the sound of her car pulling away faded into the night, Peter sat down at the table, staring at her untouched dinner. The unease that had been building in his chest solidified into something colder, something closer to fear. The morning started like any other, with Peter quietly sipping his coffee while Victoria scrolled through her phone at the kitchen island. She was distracted, as she often was lately, her fingers flying across the screen. Peter glanced up from his newspaper and cleared his throat. "You said you'd pick up the dry cleaning yesterday," he remarked, his tone casual but curious. Victoria didn't look up. "Oh, right, I didn't have time. I'll get it today." Peter's brow furrowed. "That's strange. I drove past the cleaners last night and they said it was already picked up." Her hand froze mid-sext, but only for a split second. She quickly recovered, smiling faintly. "Oh, right, I forgot. I stopped by after work." "Forgot?" Peter asked, his tone soft but pointed. "Yeah," she said, brushing him off with a laugh. "There's just so much going on right now, honestly, it slipped my mind." The explanation felt too smooth, too practiced. Peter didn't press further, but as Victoria went back to her phone, the knot in his stomach tightened. It wasn't the lie itself that bothered him. It was how easily it rolled off her tongue. He stared at the coffee cup in his hands, its warmth now feeling oddly distant. A small crack had appeared, invisible to the outside world but impossible for him to ignore. The weekend brought another gathering at Victoria's parents' home, a sprawling house filled with laughter and noise. Peter had never felt entirely comfortable here. The family's sharp wit, while charming to outsiders, often felt like a blade turned in his direction. As the group gathered in the living room, Kevin, Victoria's brother-in-law, stood up with a mischievous grin. "All right, everyone," he announced. "Time for a little game. And Peter, you're our star tonight." Peter's stomach sank. "What kind of game?" he asked, trying to sound light-hearted. Kevin waved a dismissive hand. "Relax, it's just for fun." The room buzzed with excitement as Kevin revealed an old box of childhood memorabilia. Inside was a photo of Peter as a gangly teenager, braces gleaming and his face red with embarrassment. A murmur of laughter rippled through the room as Kevin held it up. "Oh, Peter," Victoria said, giggling. "You were adorable." Peter forced a smile, his hands tightening into fists in his lap. "Where did you even get that?" "Victoria shared it," Kevin said with a grin. "Said it would be perfect for tonight." The laughter grew louder as Kevin began narrating a story from Peter's youth. One Peter had shared with Victoria in confidence, thinking it would remain between them. It was a memory tied to an old fear, a moment of vulnerability now turned into entertainment. Peter glanced at Victoria, searching for a sign of regret, but she was laughing along with everyone else, her eyes sparkling with amusement. The room's laughter grew deafening, drowning out Peter's attempts to excuse himself. When he finally escaped to the kitchen, his hands trembled as he poured himself a glass of water. He barely noticed when the glass slipped from his grip and shattered on the floor, the sound cutting through the noise of the party. Victoria appeared in the doorway, her face still flushed from laughter. "Peter, it was just a joke," she said, her tone exasperated. "Does it ever stop?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with resignation. "What are you talking about?" she replied, crossing her arms. "These jokes, these pranks. It's always me." He looked at her, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "You gave them that story, didn't you?" Victoria waved him off, stepping over the broken glass as if it wasn't even there. "Oh, Peter, you're overreacting again. Can't you just learn to laugh at yourself?" He didn't respond. Instead, he bent down to pick up the shards, his reflection staring back at him from the jagged pieces. For the first time, he realized how fractured things had truly become. It happened late one evening when the house was cloaked in an unusual quiet. Victoria had gone to bed early, claiming a headache, while Peter stayed in the living room, flipping aimlessly through the channels. His mind wandered, replaying the events of the past few weeks, the late nights, the unexplained expenses, and the dismissive responses to his concerns. Each memory felt like a piece of a puzzle, one he was reluctantly starting to piece together. As he turned off the television, his eyes fell on Victoria's phone, left charging on the kitchen counter. She was never careless with her phone. It was always either in her hand or tucked away in her bag. For a moment he hesitated, battling the familiar voice in his head that warned against invading her privacy. But something deeper, something colder, urged him forward. He picked up the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. The screen lit up, revealing a recent notification, a message from a number not saved in her contacts. "Let me know when it's done." Peter frowned, his stomach tightening. He swiped the notification away and opened her messages. Most of the conversations were mundane, chats with friends, colleagues, and the kids' school group. But the same unsaved number kept appearing in her recent messages. Always brief exchanges, always vague. Scrolling further, he stopped at a text sent earlier that day. "Don't worry, I'll handle him." His breath caught. The words seemed to leap off the screen, wrapping around him like a vice. Handle him? The phrasing felt deliberate, almost calculated. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it about him? Was it something innocent, blown out of proportion by his growing paranoia? The sound of a creak upstairs snapped him out of his thoughts. He quickly locked the phone and set it back on the counter, his hands trembling. When he returned to the couch, the glow of the muted television flickered across his face as he stared blankly at the screen. The words kept replaying in his head, growing louder and more sinister with each repetition. He thought about waking Victoria, confronting her with what he'd found. But something stopped him. He knew her too well. She'd dismiss it, twist it, make him feel like he was overreacting again. The next morning, Peter acted as if nothing had happened. He sat across from Victoria at breakfast, watching her scroll through her phone. She seemed calm, even cheerful, but to Peter, her every move now carried a shadow of suspicion. "You're up early," he said, keeping his tone light. "Busy day," she replied, not looking up. "Lots of meetings." He nodded, his gaze flickering to her phone as she placed it face down on the table. He wanted to ask about the message but decided against it. Instead, he observed, cataloging every word, every gesture. As the day wore on, Peter couldn't shake the unease. He thought about the message constantly, dissecting its meaning from every angle. That evening, after Victoria had gone out again, he found himself pacing the kitchen, his mind a chaotic swirl of doubt and fear. Finally, he reached for his own phone and dialed the number he'd seen on her screen. His hand trembled as he held the phone to his ear, each ring echoing louder than the last. "This is Kevin," a familiar voice answered, smooth and casual. Peter froze, the air knocked from his lungs. He ended the call abruptly, his hand shaking as he set the phone down. Kevin, Victoria's brother-in-law. He felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Why would Victoria be texting Kevin about handling someone? The pieces of the puzzle started to shift, rearranging themselves into a picture Peter didn't want to see. The late nights, the unexplained expenses, the constant dismissals. His thoughts spiraled, each one darker than the last. He felt a pang of guilt for jumping to conclusions, but couldn't silence the growing voice in his head, whispering that something was terribly wrong. The seed of doubt. When Victoria returned home later that night, she greeted him with a kiss on the cheek and a casual smile. "Did you eat dinner?" she asked, setting her bag down. "Yeah," Peter lied, his voice strained. He watched her move through the room, every gesture suddenly feeling rehearsed, calculated. As she disappeared upstairs, Peter sank into the couch, his head in his hands. The words from her text lingered like a storm cloud. "I'll handle him." For the first time, Peter felt certain that whatever was happening wasn't just in his head. It was real, and it was dangerous. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Peter felt tired, more tired than usual. At first, he attributed it to work. The long hours at the office, the mounting pressure to meet deadlines, and the sleepless nights spent replaying Victoria's strange behavior in his mind all seemed like plausible explanations. One evening, as he climbed the stairs to bed, a wave of dizziness hit him. He gripped the railing tightly, waiting for it to pass. When he reached the top, Victoria was standing in the doorway of their bedroom, her arms crossed. "You look awful," she said, her tone laced with mild concern. "Just tired," Peter replied, brushing it off. "Work's been a lot lately." Victoria tilted her head, studying him for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. "You need to take better care of yourself. Maybe cut back on the late nights." Her words felt hollow, almost rehearsed, but Peter nodded, too drained to argue. He crawled into bed, his body heavy with exhaustion, and drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, Peter woke with a pounding headache. His limbs felt leaden, as if the energy had been drained from him overnight. He dragged himself to the kitchen, where Victoria was already sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone. "You look pale," she remarked without looking up. "I didn't sleep well," Peter muttered, pouring himself a glass of water. The simple act felt like a monumental effort. "Maybe you're coming down with something," she suggested, her voice light. "You've been running yourself ragged." Peter nodded absently, chalking it up to stress. He went about his day as best he could, but the fatigue lingered, wrapping around him like a fog. By mid-afternoon, he felt nauseous and had to step away from his desk to sit down. Over the next few days, the symptoms worsened. The headaches became more frequent, the dizziness more debilitating. Even food seemed to turn against him, leaving him with a constant queasiness that made eating a chore. Victoria noticed, of course. She was quick to comment on his appearance, to offer him tea or a warm compress, but her concern felt surface level, almost performative. One evening, after Peter barely touched his dinner, she sat across from him, her expression one of exaggerated worry. "You really should see a doctor," she said. "This isn't normal." "I'll be fine," Peter replied, though he didn't believe his own words. "It's probably just stress." "Stress doesn't make you look like this," she countered, gesturing to him. "You've lost weight. Your color's off." Peter forced a weak smile. "I'll make an appointment." She nodded, satisfied with his answer, but Peter noticed the way her eyes flicked to the glass of water in front of him. It was a subtle glance, one he might have missed if he weren't already hyper-aware of her every move. The next day, Peter finally made it to the doctor. The tests came back inconclusive. No infections, no underlying conditions. Nothing to explain the persistent fatigue and nausea. The doctor suggested stress, prescribing rest and a lighter workload. Peter tried to follow the advice, but his condition didn't improve. If anything, it grew worse. Some mornings he struggled just to get out of bed. His mind felt sluggish, clouded by a constant haze. Even simple tasks, like tying his shoes, seemed insurmountable. Victoria, meanwhile, maintained her role as the dutiful wife. She cooked his meals, brought him tea, and reminded him to take his vitamins. But Peter couldn't shake the feeling that her concern was off. There was something too precise, too deliberate about her actions. One night, as Peter lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, a troubling thought crept into his mind. It was absurd, unthinkable, but it refused to leave. Could Victoria be involved in this? He dismissed it immediately, shaking his head. She was his wife, the mother of his children. She couldn't. But the idea had taken root, and over the following days, it grew. He started paying closer attention to her, watching the way she handled his food, the way she always seemed to hover when he ate. He noticed her habit of clearing his plate before he was even finished, of discarding the remnants before he could take a closer look. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Peter decided to test his theory. He pretended to eat, pushing the food around his plate while taking only small bites. Victoria didn't seem to notice, too engrossed in her phone to pay him much attention. After dinner, when she took his plate to the sink, Peter followed her into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway, watching as she scraped the uneaten food into the trash and rinsed the plate. "Thanks for dinner," he said casually, trying to keep his tone light. She glanced over her shoulder and smiled. "Of course, you need to keep your strength up." Her words hung in the air, heavy with irony. Peter forced a smile, but inside, his suspicion solidified into something darker. That night, as Victoria slept soundly beside him, Peter sat in the living room, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. He felt like a stranger in his own body, weak and hollowed out. The thought that his wife, his partner of so many years, could be behind this was almost too much to bear. But as the symptoms worsened and the pieces began to align, he couldn't ignore the possibility any longer. Something was happening to him, and Victoria might be the reason why. The house was unusually quiet that evening. The children were at a sleepover, and Peter had planned to spend the night catching up on some much-needed rest. But as he lay in bed, the weight of the past few weeks pressed heavily on his chest. Sleep remained elusive. He decided to head downstairs for a glass of water, hoping the cool night air would clear his mind. The creak of the stairs under his feet sounded louder than usual in the silence. As he reached the bottom step, faint voices drifted toward him from the living room. At first, he thought Victoria was on the phone, but the tone of her voice, low and urgent, made him pause. It wasn't her usual casual conversation. Peter moved closer, careful to stay out of sight, and the second voice confirmed his growing dread. It was Kevin. "He's weaker now," Kevin was saying, his tone clipped and matter-of-fact. "The timing's right. We need to finalize everything before he catches on." Peter's breath caught in his throat. He pressed himself against the wall, straining to hear more. "I know," Victoria replied, her voice sharp but quieter. "But he's not as oblivious as you think. He's been watching me lately, asking questions." Kevin let out a low chuckle. "Then you need to be smarter, distract him, keep him off balance, do what you do best." Peter's heart raced. The words were vague, but their meaning was unmistakable. His mind reeled, piecing together fragments of the past weeks, the late nights, the unexplained expenses, the text messages, and now this. "You're not worried, are you?" Kevin asked, his tone almost mocking. "Of course not," Victoria snapped. "Peter's too passive to fight back. He doesn't have it in him." The words stung, cutting through Peter's chest like a knife. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm, to keep listening. "But you need to handle your end," Victoria continued. "The accounts need to be ready. I'm not going to risk this falling apart because you got sloppy." "Relax," Kevin replied smoothly. "Everything's set. Offshore, untraceable. Once he's out of the picture, we'll both get what we deserve." Peter's grip tightened on the corner of the wall. The casual way they spoke about him, as if he were a problem to be solved, a roadblock to their plans, made his blood run cold. "What about the kids?" Victoria asked after a pause, her voice softer now. "What about them?" Kevin replied, unconcerned. "They'll be fine. You're their mother. You'll have everything you need to take care of them." There was a silence, and for a moment Peter hoped Victoria would show some hesitation, some sign of remorse. But her next words shattered that hope. "They'll adjust," she said flatly. "They always do." The finality in her tone hit Peter like a punch to the gut. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as he struggled to process what he was hearing. "Let's finish this," Kevin said, his voice breaking the silence. "We're close. Just stay focused, and it'll all be over soon." Peter couldn't listen anymore. He backed away from the living room, his legs trembling beneath him. His mind raced with questions, each one darker than the last. How long had this been going on? How far were they willing to go? And what did Kevin mean by out of the picture? As he reached the stairs, Peter hesitated. Part of him wanted to storm into the living room, to confront them right then and there, but he knew that wouldn't end well. He needed proof, something concrete to protect himself and the kids. He couldn't afford to act on raw emotion. Not yet. Back in the bedroom, Peter sat on the edge of the bed, his hands gripping the mattress. The weight of what he'd heard pressed down on him, suffocating and relentless. He glanced at Victoria's side of the bed, the neatly arranged pillows, the untouched glass of water on the nightstand. How could someone who shared his life, his home, his children, be capable of this? The sound of footsteps snapped him out of his thoughts. He quickly lay down, feigning sleep as Victoria entered the room. She moved with her usual grace, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "Busy day tomorrow," she murmured, almost to herself, as she slid under the covers. Peter kept his breathing even, his heart pounding in his chest. He waited until her breathing steadied, signaling that she'd fallen asleep. Only then did he allow himself to exhale. The next morning, Peter's resolve hardened. He needed answers. More than that, he needed evidence. He couldn't confront her. Not yet. But the game had changed. As Victoria chatted breezily over breakfast, her usual charm on full display, Peter felt a cold detachment settle over him. He nodded at the right moments, offered polite responses, but inside, he was calculating his next move. Victoria smiled at him as she left for another meeting, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. The sound now felt like a countdown, marking the time he had left to uncover the full truth. Peter watched her go, his expression unreadable. The man who had once trusted her implicitly was gone. In his place was someone ready to fight, ready to face whatever came next. That evening, Peter sat in the living room, his thoughts a storm of anger, betrayal, and confusion. The house was eerily quiet, save for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. He'd spent the day wrestling with his emotions, debating whether to confront Victoria. But the memory of her and Kevin's conversation replayed in his mind like a broken record. He couldn't ignore it any longer. When he heard the familiar sound of her car pulling into the driveway, his chest tightened. Moments later, the door opened and Victoria stepped inside, her heels clicking against the tile. She seemed surprised to find Peter waiting for her. "You were up late," she said, setting her bag on the counter. Her tone was light, almost dismissive. Peter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood, his eyes locking onto hers with a piercing intensity she couldn't ignore. "We need to talk." Victoria raised an eyebrow, her posture stiffening slightly. "Okay? About what?" Peter's voice was steady, but his anger simmered beneath the surface. "About you. About Kevin. About everything." For a split second, her expression faltered, but she quickly recovered, her face settling into a mask of feigned confusion. "What are you talking about, Peter?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," he shot back, his voice rising. "I heard you, last night, you and Kevin." Her eyes widened, but she maintained her composure. "You heard us? Doing what, Peter? Talking? You're going to accuse me of something because of a conversation?" "It wasn't just any conversation," Peter countered, stepping closer. "I heard what you said. About me. About the accounts. About being out of the picture. Do you even realize how that sounds?" Victoria crossed her arms, her demeanor shifting from confused to defensive. "Sounds like you're jumping to conclusions again, as usual." Peter's jaw clenched. "Don't turn this around on me. I've been patient, Victoria. I've ignored the late nights, the unexplained expenses, the lies. But this, I can't ignore." She let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "Lies? Expenses? Are you even listening to yourself? You're making it sound like some grand conspiracy. It's absurd." Peter took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I saw the texts, Victoria. The ones from Kevin. I'll handle him." "What does that mean?" Her face hardened, but her voice took on a calm, almost patronizing tone. "It means you've been under a lot of stress lately, and Kevin's been helping me figure out how to support you. That's what families do, Peter." "Support me?" he echoed, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Is that what you call planning behind my back? Transferring money into hidden accounts? What kind of support is that?" Victoria's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing. "Hidden accounts? You've been snooping now? That's what this is about? You can't handle the fact that I'm trying to protect our family?" Peter shook his head, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "Protect us? From what? From me?" She sighed heavily, rubbing her temples as if his accusations were exhausting her. "From yourself, Peter. You've been so paranoid lately, so unstable. I've had to make some tough decisions because you're not capable of handling everything right now." The gaslighting hit him like a slap, her calculated calmness almost convincing. "Almost." "This isn't about me," Peter said firmly. "This is about you and Kevin. I know what you're doing." Victoria tilted her head, her lips curling into a faint, dismissive smile. "What, Peter? Tell me, what am I doing? Because all I see is a husband losing his grip on reality." Her words stung, but Peter refused to back down. "Stop pretending." "I heard you, Victoria. You don't care about me. You don't even care about the kids. This is all about you, about money, about power." She stepped closer, her voice low and icy. "You really want to go there? After everything I've done for this family, you're going to sit there and accuse me of what? Betrayal? Because you overheard a conversation you didn't understand?" Peter's fists clenched at his sides, his voice breaking slightly. "I understand more than you think. You've been poisoning me, haven't you? Slowly, so no one would suspect. That's why I've been so sick." Victoria's eyes widened briefly before narrowing again. She let out a laugh, the sound cold and cutting. "Poisoning you? Are you serious right now? You've lost it, Peter, completely." "Thank you for the reflection, Cindy." But Peter saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. Brief as it was enough to confirm his suspicions. He stepped back, his heart pounding. "You can keep lying, Victoria, but I'll find the truth. And when I do, you'll regret underestimating me." Victoria's expression hardened, her mask of control slipping for just a moment. "You're pathetic," she said, her voice venomous. "Always have been. That's why they laugh at you, Peter. That's why you'll never be enough." The words cut deeper than he expected, but they only fueled his determination. Without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving her standing there, her cold gaze following him as he walked away. As Peter climbed the stairs, his mind raced. He knew the confrontation hadn't given him the answers he needed, but it had confirmed one thing: Victoria was dangerous. And now, he needed to protect himself and his children from whatever came next. The following afternoon, Peter sat in his car in the driveway, staring blankly at his phone. He had been scrolling through old photos of his family, searching for some semblance of clarity in a situation that felt increasingly surreal. The laughter and love captured in those images now felt like ghosts from another life. His thoughts were interrupted by a message notification. It was from Elizabeth, Victoria's sister. "Can we talk? Privately? It's important." Peter frowned, his stomach knotting. Elizabeth and Victoria were close, inseparable at times. For her to reach out like this with no context was unusual. He replied quickly, agreeing to meet her at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Elizabeth was already seated when Peter arrived, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. She looked up as he approached, her expression a mixture of concern and hesitation. "Thanks for coming," she said softly as he slid into the chair across from her. "Of course," Peter replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's going on?" Elizabeth hesitated, glancing around the cafe as if making sure no one was listening. Finally, she leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Peter, I don't know how to say this, but I think something's wrong with Victoria." Peter's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "She's been different lately," Elizabeth continued, her eyes searching his face. "Secretive, cold. I've tried talking to her about it, but she shuts me down every time. And then there's Kevin." Peter's jaw clenched at the mention of Kevin's name. "What about him?" Elizabeth sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "They've been spending a lot of time together, more than they should. At first I thought it was just family stuff, business maybe. But it doesn't feel right, Peter. It hasn't for a while." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Peter leaned back, his mind racing. "Do you know anything specific, anything they've said or done?" Elizabeth hesitated again, clearly struggling with how much to reveal. "I don't have proof," she admitted, "but I overheard them talking a few weeks ago. It was late, and they didn't realize I was still in the house. They were whispering about, I don't know, plans, money, and you." Peter's heart sank. "What did they say?" "It didn't mention details," she replied, her voice filled with frustration. "But it sounded serious, like they were plotting something. When I asked Victoria about it later, she brushed me off, said I was being paranoid." Peter exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You're not the only one she's accused of that." Elizabeth reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. "Peter, you need to be careful. I don't know what's going on, but I'm worried. About you, about the kids." Peter nodded, his throat tight. "I've been feeling the same way. Things haven't been right for months. She's been lying to me, staying out late, moving money around, and Kevin? He's in the middle of all of it." Elizabeth's grip on his hand tightened. "I knew it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've seen the way he looks at her, the way they talk when they think no one's watching. It's not normal." Peter's stomach churned. Hearing his own fears echoed back to him made them feel even more real, more urgent. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I can't just accuse her without proof. She'll twist it, make me look crazy." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "You're right. She's good at that. She always has been." Her voice softened, tinged with regret. "You know, when we were kids, Victoria was always the one who could lie her way out of anything. She'd make you believe her version of events, no matter how ridiculous they were." Peter's heart sank further. He thought about the countless times Victoria had dismissed his concerns, turned his accusations back on him, made him question his own judgment. So, what am I supposed to do? Just wait for her to destroy everything? "No," Elizabeth said firmly. "You need to protect yourself. Start gathering evidence. Document everything. Her behavior, her spending, her interactions with Kevin. If there's something going on, you need to be ready to prove it." Peter nodded, her words grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in weeks. "You're right. I'll start tonight." Elizabeth hesitated again, her expression shifting to one of guilt. "There's something else," she said quietly. "What is it?" Peter asked, his voice tense. "I think Kevin is manipulating her," Elizabeth confessed. "Victoria is not innocent in this. I'm not saying that. But Kevin, he's dangerous. He knows how to get under people's skin, how to control them. I've seen it before, with other women he's been involved with." Peter felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Elizabeth looked away, her eyes filled with regret. "Because I didn't want to believe it. She's my sister, Peter. I wanted to think she was better than this." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cafe buzzed softly around them, the clinking of cups and murmurs of conversation a distant hum. Finally, Peter broke the silence. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady, "for telling me, for being honest." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes glistening. "I just want you to be safe, you and the kids." Peter stood, his resolve hardening with each passing second. "We will be," he said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." As he walked out of the cafe, the weight of the conversation settled heavily on his shoulders. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone in this, and now he had a plan. The following evening, Peter sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the untouched dinner Victoria had left for him before heading out for another meeting. The food, meticulously plated as always, now seemed sinister. He couldn't bring himself to eat it, his growing suspicions casting a dark shadow over the meal. His mind raced with fragments of Elizabeth's warning, Victoria's gaslighting, and Kevin's cryptic conversations. He pushed the plate aside, his appetite replaced by a gnawing sense of urgency. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed to find out. He grabbed Megan's hand again, and they back-tripped to their father's bungalow. Later that night, as Peter cleaned up the kitchen, his movements were mechanical, his thoughts elsewhere. He picked up the trash bag to take it outside, but as he tied the knot, something caught his eye, a glint of white among the crumpled paper towels and food scraps. Peter paused, his pulse quickening. He opened the bag and sifted through the contents, grimacing at the mess. His hand froze when he found it, a small, crushed pill bottle. The label was faded, but he could still make out the remnants of Victoria's name and the words, "prescription only." His hands trembled as he turned the bottle over. There were still a few pills inside, white, round, and unfamiliar. He placed the bottle on the counter, staring at it like it was a venomous snake. The next morning, Peter took the bottle to the pharmacy. He waited anxiously as the pharmacist examined it, their expression neutral but curious. "Seizures are benzodiazepines," the pharmacist explained. "A strong anti-anxiety medication. Were these prescribed to you?" Peter shook his head. "No, I found them at home." The pharmacist frowned. "Well, they're not dangerous when used as directed, but in high doses or combined with other substances, they can cause serious side effects, drowsiness, confusion, even fainting. You should ask whoever these belong to." Peter's stomach churned. He already knew the answer. That evening, Peter couldn't shake the nausea that had settled in his gut. He sat in the living room, staring at the pill bottle on the coffee table. The pieces were falling into place, each one more horrifying than the last. The unexplained fatigue, the dizziness, the relentless nausea. It wasn't stress, it wasn't overwork. It was her. When Victoria returned home, she found Peter sitting in the dark, his silhouette illuminated by the faint glow of the lamp. She hesitated for a moment, her polished facade slipping just slightly. "Why are you sitting here like that?" she asked, setting her purse down. Peter didn't reply immediately. Instead, he held up the pill bottle, his fingers tightening around it. "What are these?" Her eyes flicked to the bottle, and for the briefest moment, Peter saw it. Fear. But she quickly recovered, letting out a dismissive laugh. "Those? They're my anxiety meds. You know I've been stressed lately." "Stressed?" Peter repeated, his voice calm but cold. "So stressed you've been slipping these into my food?" Her smile faltered. "What are you talking about?" "Don't lie to me, Victoria," he said, standing. His voice was steady, but the anger in his eyes was unmistakable. "I've been sick for weeks. Weak, dizzy, and now I find these in the trash? What are you doing to me?" Victoria scoffed, her laugh sharp and defensive. "You're paranoid, Peter. Do you even hear yourself? You're making up stories to blame me for your health problems." But Peter didn't back down. He stepped closer, holding the bottle between them like damning evidence. "I had these checked. The pharmacist told me what they can do, how dangerous they are in high doses, and I know you've been using them on me." Her expression hardened, the mask of innocence replaced by something colder. "You don't know what you're talking about," she hissed. "Don't I?" he shot back, his voice rising. "I heard you and Kevin. I know about the money, the lies, the plan to get me out of the picture. And now this? What's the endgame, Victoria? Were you hoping I'd collapse one day so you could finally be rid of me?" Victoria's silence was deafening, her eyes locked on his. For the first time, Peter saw the person behind the mask, a woman driven by ambition and greed, willing to destroy anyone who got in her way. "You're insane," she said finally, her voice low and venomous. "You're so wrapped up in your own paranoia that you can't see reality." "Reality?" Peter said, his voice trembling with anger. "Reality is that I trusted you. I built a life with you, and now you're trying to tear it all apart." Victoria stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You have no proof. No one will believe you. You're just a sick, paranoid man grasping at straws." Peter stared at her, his resolve hardening. "We'll see about that." The conversation ended in icy silence. Victoria retreated upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. Peter remained in the living room, gripping the pill bottle like a lifeline. His mind was clearer now, his suspicions confirmed. He had been right all along. He knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. This wasn't just about him, it was about protecting his children, about exposing the truth. Victoria's carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down, and Peter was determined to make sure she paid for every lie, every betrayal, and every ounce of poison she'd slipped into his life. Peter woke up to the smell of breakfast wafting from the kitchen. Bacon sizzled, and the sound of eggs cracking echoed through the quiet house. He rubbed his eyes, his body still aching from weeks of unexplained fatigue. The argument from the previous night lingered in his mind, but today he felt something sharper. A need for vigilance. He got out of bed slowly, his limbs heavy but his mind sharper than it had been in weeks. As he descended the stairs, he found Victoria humming softly to herself, placing a steaming plate of food on the table. The sight unsettled him. "Good morning," she said brightly, her tone unnervingly cheerful. "I thought I'd make you something special." Peter forced a smile, his instincts on high alert. "Thanks," he replied, taking his seat. He glanced at the plate. Scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast. Everything prepared just the way he liked it. Yet, the sight made his stomach churn. He picked up his fork, hesitating for a fraction of a second. Victoria leaned against the counter, watching him too closely. Her gaze wasn't casual, it was calculating. "Aren't you going to eat?" she asked, her voice sweet but with a faint edge. Peter forced himself to take a small bite of toast, chewing slowly. As he swallowed, He felt his throat tighten, not from the food, but from the oppressive weight of her presence. He pushed the plate slightly forward. "I'll finish in a bit. Just need some coffee first." Victoria frowned but said nothing, turning back to the sink. Peter stood and poured himself a cup of coffee, pretending to sip it while keeping her in his peripheral vision. She seemed calm, but Peter could feel the tension radiating from her. After breakfast, Peter took the plate to the trash under the guise of cleaning up. As he scraped the food into the bin, his eyes caught a faint, powdery residue clinging to the edge of the plate. His stomach twisted. It was subtle, almost invisible, but he recognized it instantly. He quickly rinsed the plate, masking his growing panic. He needed to act carefully. If she suspected he was onto her, she might escalate. For now, he had to bide his time. Later that day, the symptoms began. It started with dizziness, then a crushing wave of nausea. Peter sat on the edge of the couch, gripping the cushions as his vision blurred. His chest tightened, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just stress or illness. Victoria appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "You don't look so good," she remarked, her tone laced with false concern. "Maybe you should lie down." Peter struggled to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice weak. "Maybe I will." As he moved past her, he felt her eyes on him, cold and calculating. He climbed the stairs, each step a monumental effort. Reaching the bedroom, he locked the door behind him and collapsed onto the bed. His mind raced through possibilities. If he stayed, he might not make it through the night. After an hour of restless deliberation, Peter made his decision. He gathered a few essential items, a phone charger, wallet, and a change of clothes, and slipped them into a small backpack. His movements were slow, careful, as the lingering effects of the poison sapped his strength. Once night fell, Peter waited until he heard Victoria retreat to the bedroom. The soft click of the door closing signaled his opportunity. He quietly slipped out of the house, his heart pounding in his chest. The cool night air hit him like a shock, clearing his mind just enough to propel him forward. Peter drove aimlessly at first, his vision still slightly blurred. He finally pulled into the parking lot of a small motel on the outskirts of town. Inside, he rented a room with cash, the dim lights and musty smell doing little to ease his anxiety. Once inside, he locked the door and leaned against it, his breathing ragged. Reaching into his bag, Peter pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He hesitated before dialing Elizabeth's number. When she picked up, her voice was laced with concern. "Peter? What's going on?" "I need help," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's worse than we thought." Elizabeth arrived an hour later, her face pale as she took in Peter's appearance. "You look terrible," she said, sitting beside him on the bed. "She tried to poison me again," Peter said bluntly. He pulled out the plate he had swiped from the kitchen, still wrapped in a plastic bag. "There was something on this, I know it." Elizabeth's eyes widened, and she nodded. "We'll take it to someone who can test it. This is evidence, Peter. You need to document everything." Peter's hands shook as he held the bag. "She's not going to stop, Elizabeth. I don't know how far she's willing to go." Elizabeth placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll figure this out. You're not alone in this." The next morning, Peter felt slightly stronger, though the effects of the poison lingered. He knew he couldn't return home, not yet. Instead, he focused on gathering evidence. He called a private investigator Elizabeth recommended, a no-nonsense woman named Clara, who agreed to meet him that afternoon. Clara listened intently as Peter laid out everything: the suspicious pills, the overheard conversations, the financial discrepancies, and now the poisoning attempt. "This is serious," she said, her voice steady but firm. "If what you're saying is true, we'll need concrete proof. Can you access the accounts? Any documents or correspondence?" Peter nodded. "I can try, but I need to be careful. She's watching my every move." Clara handed him a small recording device. "Start recording everything: conversations, phone calls, even ambient noise in the house. If she slips up, we'll catch it." By the end of the day, Peter felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't out of danger. But he wasn't defenseless either. As he sat in the motel room, reviewing the steps Clara had outlined, he realized something profound. This wasn't just a fight to expose Victoria and Kevin. It was a fight to reclaim his life, his dignity, and his future. The narrow escape had left him shaken, but it also gave him clarity. He wouldn't let them win. Not now, not ever. The morning after his narrow escape, Peter sat in the corner of the small motel room, clutching a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His mind raced with the events of the past few days. The realization that Victoria had been poisoning him, coupled with Elizabeth's warning, left him on edge. But now, he had a plan. Later that day, he met Clara, the private investigator Elizabeth had recommended. Clara was a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a reputation for uncovering the truth in even the most tangled situations. As Peter recounted his story, her expression remained calm, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. "This isn't just betrayal," she said when he finished. "This is premeditated. If they're willing to go this far, there's more to this than you know. We'll start with the accounts and work from there." Clara wasted no time. She set up a secure communication line for Peter and advised him to stay out of the house as much as possible. "They're likely monitoring everything, your emails, your phone, maybe even your movements," she warned. "If you give them any indication you're onto them, they'll tighten their grip." Peter nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Access," Clara replied. "Bank statements, passwords, anything that can give us a trail to follow. These kinds of schemes usually leave a paper trail if you know where to look." Peter handed over what he could, a few old bank statements, some of Victoria's business correspondence he'd managed to download, and the details of their shared accounts. "She handles most of the finances," he admitted. "I trusted her with it." Clara gave him a look that was equal parts pity and determination. Trust like that is exactly what people like her exploit. But don't worry, Peter. We'll find what they're hiding. Over the next few days, Clara worked tirelessly. She pored through the financial records, cross-referencing transactions and uncovering discrepancies Peter hadn't noticed. Small withdrawals, repeated over time, added up to significant sums. Transfers to accounts he didn't recognize raised red flags. Peter stayed in constant contact, providing whatever additional information Clara needed. He felt a growing sense of unease as the investigation progressed. The evidence was piling up, but so was his dread. Then Clara called him one evening, her tone urgent. "I've found something." Peter's heart raced. "What is it?" "There are offshore accounts," she said. "Several of them. The money's been funneled out slowly over months, maybe years. The account holder's name isn't directly tied to Victoria, but the signatures on the transfers match hers perfectly." Peter sat in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation crashing over him. "Offshore accounts?" he repeated. "How much money are we talking about?" "Hundreds of thousands," Clara replied. "And that's just what I've found so far. There could be more." Peter ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning. How did I not see this? How could she hide something like this? "Because she didn't want you to see it," Clara said bluntly. "This was calculated, Peter. Every withdrawal, every transfer, it was designed to go unnoticed. But now that we know where to look, we can start building the case." Clara's next steps involved digging deeper into the accounts and tracing the money's path. Peter felt a mix of anger and betrayal as he watched her uncover more layers of deceit. Victoria had used shell companies to mask the transfers, creating a web of financial transactions that would be difficult for anyone to untangle. But Clara was relentless. "This isn't just about hiding money," she told Peter during one of their late-night strategy calls. "It's about control. If she's planning to cut you out of the picture, this money is her safety net." Peter clenched his fists, the rage building inside him. "I won't let her get away with this." "You won't," Clara assured him. "We're going to expose every single piece of this." The breakthrough came a week later. Clara had managed to trace one of the offshore accounts to Kevin. His name appeared as a beneficiary with significant deposits from the shared account Victoria had been siphoning money from. Peter felt his stomach drop. Kevin, he muttered. Of course. He's been in on this the whole time. Clara nodded. It's not just Victoria. He's a key player in this. The money, the manipulation, it's all connected. They've been working together. Peter sat back, the enormity of it all threatening to overwhelm him. What do we do now? We keep digging, Clara said firmly. The more we find, the stronger your case will be. But you need to be careful, Peter. They're not going to take this lying down if they suspect you know. Over the next few days, Peter followed Clara's advice. He stayed out of the house as much as possible, using the motel as his base of operations. He continued to document everything, recording phone calls, saving emails, and photographing anything suspicious. Clara provided regular updates, each one revealing more damning evidence. Victoria and Kevin's scheme was unraveling, but Peter knew the most dangerous part was yet to come. They still didn't know he was onto them, and he intended to keep it that way until the time was right. One evening, as Peter reviewed the latest findings, he felt a sense of resolve settle over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was regaining control. The truth was coming to light, and with Clara's help, he was one step closer to exposing everything. Victoria and Kevin had underestimated him. They thought they could manipulate, deceive, and destroy him without consequence. But Peter was no longer the passive, trusting man they'd preyed on. He was ready to fight back. And this time, he wouldn't stop until justice was served. A few nights later, Clara called Peter with a sense of urgency in her voice. "We need to talk," she said. "I've uncovered something that changes everything." Peter's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "It's Kevin," Clara replied. "He's not just an accomplice in this. He's the one orchestrating it." The words hit Peter like a freight train. He had always suspected Kevin's involvement, but to hear that he was the mastermind left him momentarily stunned. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tight. "He traced some of the offshore account activity back to Kevin," Clara explained. "But it goes deeper. There are communications, emails, encrypted messages, where he's giving instructions. He's been manipulating Victoria from the start." Peter sat in silence, absorbing the revelation. "Manipulating her? How?" Clara hesitated before continuing. "It looks like he's been threatening her. The emails suggest he knows something about her past, something she's desperate to keep hidden. He's using that to control her, to force her into going along with his plans." Peter's mind raced. What kind of leverage could he possibly have over her? "I'm not entirely sure yet," Clara admitted, "but it's serious enough that she's willing to betray you, the kids, and everything else just to keep it buried." As Clara detailed Cabin's role, Peter felt a mix of anger and grim clarity. Cabin had always been charming, always quick with a joke or a casual smile. But now, Peter saw the truth. Cabin's charm was a mask, hiding his calculated cruelty. "He's the one who pushed her to siphon money," Clara continued. "The offshore accounts are in his name, but Victoria's been doing the legwork to move the funds." "And the poisoning?" "There are messages where he suggests weakening you, though he's careful not to be explicit." Peter's stomach churned. "So he's been using her as a puppet, and she's too afraid to fight back." "Exactly," Clara said. "But make no mistake, Peter. She's not innocent in this. She's made her choices, but Kevin is the driving force." Over the next few days, Clara provided more evidence of Kevin's involvement. The messages painted a picture of a man who thrived on control. He had identified Victoria's vulnerabilities and exploited them mercilessly. Peter felt a surge of guilt as he thought about the years he had spent trusting Kevin, even confiding in him at times. "How did I not see this?" he muttered during one of his calls with Clara. "Because he didn't want you to," she replied. People like Kevin are experts at hiding in plain sight. They play the role of the charming friend, the helpful brother-in-law, all while pulling the strings. That evening, Peter sat in the motel room, staring at the growing pile of evidence. The photos, documents, and recordings felt overwhelming, yet they also gave him strength. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting to expose Kevin for what he truly was. Peter couldn't help but think about Victoria. Despite her betrayal, he now saw her in a different light, She wasn't just complicit, she was trapped. Kevin had her cornered, using whatever leverage he had to keep her under his thumb. But even that realization didn't erase the pain of her choices. The turning point came when Clara discovered a key piece of evidence, a document signed by Kevin authorizing a major transfer from one of the offshore accounts. "This proves his direct involvement," she told Peter. "It's not just Victoria. He's the one benefiting from all of this." Peter stared at the document, his anger boiling over. "He's not going to get away with this," he said firmly. Clara nodded. "We're getting closer, Peter. But we need to be smart. If Kevin realizes we're on to him, he'll try to cover his tracks." The revelation about Kevin's role shifted everything. Peter's focus sharpened, his resolve hardening with each passing day. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about justice. Kevin had manipulated, deceived, and coerced his way into their lives, leaving destruction in his wake. But Peter was determined to bring it all to light. As he prepared for the next step in the investigation, Peter felt a renewed sense of purpose. Kevin's true role had been exposed, and Peter wasn't going to stop until both he and Victoria were held accountable. For the first time in weeks, he felt the faint glimmer of hope. The truth was finally within reach. Peter's heart raced as he sat alone in his car outside the house. Clara's advice echoed in his mind: get them talking, let them feel secure. If they think you're out of the picture, they'll drop their guard. He clutched the small recording device in his hand, its blinking red light a reminder of how high the stakes had become. He had waited for this moment. After weeks of gathering evidence, this confrontation would be the key to exposing Kevin and Victoria. Tonight, they thought he was staying at a hotel. Tonight, they'd make their plans without suspecting he was listening. He crept into the house through the back door, careful not to make a sound. The familiar layout was now filled with an eerie tension, every creak of the floorboards amplified in the silence. From the living room, he heard their voices, low, conspiratorial. His pulse quickened. "Peter's been acting strange," Victoria said, her voice edged with frustration. "I think he suspects something." "Let him," Kevsey replied smoothly. "He's weak. By the time he figures anything out, it'll be too late." Peter slipped into the shadows near the doorway, positioning the recorder to capture every word. He forced himself to stay calm, to listen without reacting. Victoria's tone grew sharper. "It's getting harder to keep up the act. He's been asking questions, watching me." "That's why we need to move faster," Kevin said. His voice carried an unsettling confidence. "The accounts are ready, the money's in place. We just need to deal with him." Peter's breath caught. Deal with him. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Victoria hesitated. "What are you suggesting? He's still the father of my children." Kevin's laugh was low and cruel. "And you think he'd let you keep them after this? No, Victoria. He's a liability. We can't afford to leave loose ends." Peter's grip on the recorder tightened as Kevin continued. "The poisoning has already weakened him. He's fragile, confused. It wouldn't take much to finish the job. An accident, something no one would question." "An accident?" Victoria's voice wavered slightly, but she didn't reject the idea. "And if someone investigates?" "They won't," Kevin said firmly. "I've handled this before. You let me worry about the details." Peter felt a wave of nausea. The casual way they discussed his demise was both chilling and infuriating, but he forced himself to stay still, to keep listening. Victoria sighed. "I don't know, Kevin. This is risky. If we're caught—" "We won't be caught," Kevin interrupted. "Not if you do exactly as I say. You've come this far, Victoria. Don't lose your nerve now." Her silence was deafening. Peter could almost hear the internal struggle in her mind, the tug of war between fear and greed. Finally, she spoke. "Fine, but it has to be clean. No suspicion." "It will be," Kevin assured her. "Just stick to the plan. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, we'll be long gone." Peter's anger burned hotter with each word. They were planning his death, discussing it as though it were a mere inconvenience, but now he had what he needed. Every damning word was captured, recorded, and ready to be used against them. "I tracked He waited for their conversation to shift before retreating. As Kevin and Victoria moved to the kitchen discussing logistics, Peter slipped out the way he had come. The cool night air hit him like a lifeline as he hurried back to his car, his hands trembling with a mix of fear and adrenaline. Once he was safely inside, Peter played back the recording, ensuring every word was clear. The weight of what he had just witnessed settled over him. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was a fight for his life. He called Clara immediately, his voice shaking as he recounted what had happened. "I have them," he said, the relief palpable. "I got everything, the plan, the accounts, even the poisoning." "Good," Clara replied, her tone steady and reassuring. "This is the final piece we needed. Now we can take it to the authorities. But Peter, you need to be careful. They'll come after you if they suspect you have this." Peter nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I'll stay out of sight. Just tell me what to do next." The following day, Peter handed the recording to Clara, along with all the evidence they had gathered. She assured him it would be enough to build an airtight case. But Peter knew the fight wasn't over. Kevin and Victoria wouldn't go down without a struggle. As he left Clara's office, a sense of determination filled him. He had survived their betrayal, their manipulation, and their attempts to destroy him. Now, he was ready to take the fight to them. Peter wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a man reclaiming his life, one step at a time, and he wouldn't stop until Victoria and Kevin faced the full weight of their actions. The morning was quiet, almost unnervingly so, as Peter walked into the police station. The recording device, along with the meticulously gathered evidence, sat heavily in his pocket, a testament to weeks of fear and determination. Clara had assured him that everything he had would be more than enough to force the authorities to act. But doubt still gnawed at him. He approached the front desk, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "I need to speak to someone about a crime," he said, sliding the recorder across the desk. "It involves conspiracy, financial fraud, and attempted murder." The officer on duty raised an eyebrow but quickly summoned a detective. Within minutes, Peter was seated in a small room, recounting the entire harrowing story. The detective, a sharp-eyed woman named Sanders, listened intently, her pen flying across her notepad. As Peter played the recording, Sanders' expression shifted. The cold, calculated way Kevin and Victoria had spoken about his death sent visible chills through her. When the recording ended, she sat back, her face grim. "This is damning evidence," she said. "With what you've given us, this recording, the financial records, the messages, we can build a strong case. But I need to ask, are you prepared for what comes next?" Peter nodded. "I've been living in fear for weeks. I'm ready to end this." The operation began that same day. Officers executed search warrants on Kevin's home and Victoria's accounts, uncovering more evidence that corroborated Peter's claims. Clara's research had been thorough, and the paper trail connecting the offshore accounts to Kevin and Victoria left no room for doubt. When the arrests came, Peter wasn't present, but Clara kept him updated. Kevin was picked up first, taken into custody at his office. His characteristic smirk reportedly faded the moment the police entered the room. Victoria, on the other hand, was arrested at home, the shock evident on her face as officers explained the charges. That evening, Peter received a call from Detective Sanders. "We have them both," she said. "The evidence you provided made it impossible for them to wiggle out. Kevin is already trying to shift blame onto Victoria." Peter felt a mixture of relief and anger. And Victoria? And Victoria? "She's denying everything, but her involvement is clear," Sanders replied. "The poisoning, the financial fraud, it's all linked back to her. She'll have a chance to defend herself in court, but it's not looking good." The news spread quickly. The story of Kevin and Victoria's arrest made headlines, the details of their conspiracy sending shockwaves through the community. Friends and acquaintances who had once admired them now recoiled in disbelief. Peter, meanwhile, kept a low profile, staying at a safe location as the case moved forward. The arrests marked the beginning of the end for Kevin and Victoria. But for Peter, they signaled something more profound, a chance to reclaim his life. For weeks he had been their victim, their pawn. Now he was the one holding the pieces, and the board was finally his. The aftermath of Victoria and Kevin's arrest rippled through the community like a shockwave. News outlets eagerly picked up the story, detailing the tangled web of deceit, fraud, and attempted murder. Headlines painted a damning picture: family betrayal, husband uncovers deadly conspiracy. The names of Victoria, Kevin, and even their extended family were plastered across every screen and newspaper in town. At first, Victoria's family tried to contain the damage. They issued a terse statement denying involvement, framing the situation as a misunderstanding. But as the details emerged, the poisoned food, the offshore accounts, the recordings, it became impossible to maintain their facade. The first cracks appeared during a press conference held by Victoria's parents. They had long been the pillars of their social circle, hosting lavish parties and portraying their family as the epitome of success. But on this day, their polished image crumbled under the weight of questions they couldn't answer. "Did you know about the offshore accounts?" a reporter asked, thrusting a microphone forward. "No comment," Victoria's father replied, his face flushed with anger. Another voice shouted, "How do you respond to claims that your family enabled Victoria's behavior?" Victoria's mother tried to deflect. "These accusations are baseless. Our daughter is a kind, loving woman who tried to murder her husband," someone interrupted, the cutting remark silencing the room. The cameras captured every moment. The tension, the stumbles, the silent glances exchanged between Victoria's parents. They left the podium soon after, their dignity in tatters. Meanwhile, Victoria's siblings faced scrutiny as well. Kevin's wife, who had been conspicuously absent from public appearances, became a central figure in the narrative. The media uncovered years of infidelity, shady business dealings, and instances where Kevin had used his charm to manipulate others into silence. Elizabeth, Victoria's sister, was the only one who stepped forward with honesty. She granted an exclusive interview, her voice trembling but resolute. "I've tried to warn Peter for years," she admitted, tears glistening in her eyes. "I didn't know the full extent of what was happening, but I knew something was wrong. Victoria and Kevin, they weren't who they pretended to be." Her candidness earned her sympathy, but it also brought backlash from her own family. Peter heard whispers of her being ostracized, but she didn't seem to care. The truth had to come out, she told him during one of their late-night phone calls. In social circles where appearances had always been paramount, Victoria's family became pariahs. Invitations stopped arriving. Business deals quietly fell through. Friends who once flocked to their gatherings now avoided them entirely. Gossip spread like wildfire, dissecting every detail of the case, every misstep, every public stumble. Victoria's father, once a prominent figure in local politics, resigned from several boards amid mounting pressure. Kevin's company filed for bankruptcy, the fallout from his financial misdeeds dragging it under. Even Victoria's mother, who had always prided herself on her charity work, faced accusations of misusing funds. For Peter, watching the family's downfall was a mixture of vindication and sadness. He had endured years of their condescension, their pranks, their subtle and overt ways of undermining him. Seeing them finally held accountable was satisfying, but it also reminded him of everything he had lost, the family he thought he had, the trust that had been shattered. Despite everything, he kept his focus on his children. They were shielded from the worst of the media storm, staying with Elizabeth during the height of the chaos. Peter made it clear that they were not to be dragged into the public spectacle. One moment stood out above the rest. Peter received a letter from Victoria's mother, handwritten on elegant stationery. The tone was apologetic, almost pleading. "Dear Peter," it began, "we never meant for things to go this far. I know we've hurt you, and for that, I'm deeply sorry. Please remember the good times we shared, and know that despite everything, we always considered you part of our family." Peter read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. He didn't respond. Their apology came too late, and their actions had spoken louder than words ever could. The final blow came during Victoria and Kevin's trial. As the evidence was laid out, Peter's recordings, the financial documents, the testimony from Clara and Elizabeth. Their schemes were laid bare for all to see. Victoria's family, once so proud and untouchable, sat in the courtroom, their faces pale and drawn. They avoided Peter's gaze, their shame palpable. When the verdicts were announced, the courtroom buzzed with emotion. Peter didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The truth had spoken for itself, and the weight of their actions now rested squarely on their shoulders. In the weeks that followed, Victoria's family faded from the public eye, their once bright reputation reduced to whispers and tabloid fodder. For Peter, the knowledge that their lies and manipulations had been exposed was enough. He had fought for the truth, and he had won. Now it was time to rebuild. The house was quiet, a far cry from the chaos that had consumed their lives just weeks ago. Peter stood in the living room, staring at a framed picture of his children on the mantel. Their smiles, captured during a happier time, were a stark reminder of what he had been fighting for all along. The sound of laughter drifted in from the backyard, pulling Peter from his thoughts. He stepped outside and found his two youngest, Ethan and Chloe, running through the sprinkler, their giggles filling the warm summer air. For a moment, Peter simply watched, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. They were beginning to heal, though the road ahead would still be long. Later that evening, Peter sat at the dinner table with all three of his children. The simple act of sharing a meal together felt monumental, a step toward reclaiming the family bond that had been strained by betrayal and deceit. His eldest, Sarah, spoke first. "Dad," she began hesitantly, "are we going to be okay?" Peter set down his fork, meeting her gaze with unwavering honesty. "Yes, we will," he said. "Things are different now, but we're still a family, and that's what matters most." Sarah nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Ethan and Chloe chimed in with their own questions, mostly about school and upcoming soccer games. Peter answered each one patiently, grateful for the normalcy returning to their lives. Over the following weeks, Peter made a concerted effort to be present in his children's lives. He attended every game, every recital, every parent-teacher meeting. Each moment spent with them felt like a small victory, a chance to rebuild the trust that had been eroded by the turmoil of the past. One evening, as Peter helped Chloe with her homework, she looked up at him and asked, "Dad, are you happy now?" The question caught him off guard. He paused, considering his response carefully. "I'm getting there," he said finally. "But being here with you, that makes me happy." Chloe smiled and went back to her math problems, her innocence a reminder of why Peter had fought so hard to protect them. Sarah, who had initially been the most distant, began to open up as well. One night she sat down with Peter on the porch, the stars twinkling above them. "I was mad at you," she admitted quietly, "for not noticing what Mom was doing, for letting it happen." Peter's heart ached at her words, but he nodded. "I understand," he said. "I was mad at myself too, but I promise I'll never let anything like that happen again." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, her voice softer now. "I know, Dad. I can see you're trying." As the months passed, the wounds began to heal. The laughter returned to their home, tentative at first, but growing stronger with each passing day. Peter watched his children thrive, their resilience inspiring him to keep moving forward. He knew there were still challenges ahead, but he was no longer afraid. Together, they would face whatever came next. One evening, as they sat around the fire pit roasting marshmallows, Ethan turned to Peter with a grin. "Dad, this is the best." Peter smiled, the warmth of the fire reflected in his eyes. "It's only the beginning," he said, and for the first time in a long while, he truly believed it. The courtroom was packed, a sea of faces waiting to hear the conclusion of a case that had gripped the town for weeks. Peter sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze steady as the judge called for the final arguments. Across the room, Victoria sat at the defendant's table, her once confident demeanor replaced by a pale, haunted expression. Kevin sat beside her, his cold detachment a stark contrast to her visible anxiety. The prosecution had laid out a damning case. The recordings, financial records, and witness testimony painted an irrefutable picture of greed and betrayal. Now it was time for the defense's closing statement. Victoria's lawyer stood, adjusting his tie before addressing the jury. He attempted to paint her as a victim of Kevin's manipulation, a woman coerced into making terrible decisions out of fear and desperation. But the argument felt hollow, each point deflated by the mountain of evidence stacked against her. Then Victoria rose. The courtroom fell silent as she approached the stand, her hands trembling slightly. She looked toward Peter, her expression a mixture of regret and desperation. "I made mistakes," she began, her voice wavering. "Terrible ones. But I never wanted it to go this far. Kevin, he pushed me, he threatened me. I was scared, and I thought I had no choice." Her voice broke, tears streaming down her face. "Peter, I know I hurt you. I've betrayed you in ways I can never take back. But I'm begging you, please, find it in your heart to forgive me." The room remained silent as her words hung in the air. Peter felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom on him. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, and stepped toward the stand. He locked eyes with Victoria, her tear-streaked face a stark contrast to the calm resolve he carried. "Forgive you?" he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You poisoned me. You betrayed our family. You took everything I gave you, my trust, my love, and you used it against me." Victoria flinched, but Peter continued, his voice growing stronger. "You poisoned my body, Victoria, but you couldn't poison my soul." He touched Victoria's cheek. The room was deathly quiet, his words resonating with a power that left no room for rebuttal. He turned to face the jury, his final words not just for them, but for everyone in the room. "I've spent weeks fighting for my life, for my children, for the truth, and now I'm done fighting. It's your turn to decide what happens next." Peter returned to his seat, the weight of his statement settling over the room. Victoria lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. The jury deliberated for what felt like an eternity, but when they returned, the verdict was swift: guilty on all counts. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom as he handed down the sentence. Peter felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of closure. Justice had been served. As the courtroom emptied, Peter lingered for a moment, watching as Victoria was led away in handcuffs. She glanced back at him one last time, her face a mixture of sorrow and defeat. He didn't look away, but he didn't follow her either. There was nothing left to say. Walking out into the bright afternoon sun, Peter took a deep breath. The battle was over. Now, it was time to rebuild, not just his life, but his sense of peace. The poison was gone, and for the first time in months, he felt free. The remote job in Azerbaijan wasn't something Peter had planned. It was something he stumbled into during a late-night search for a fresh start. The project, a major construction and development initiative, promised long hours, demanding tasks, and a chance to escape the memories that still haunted him. It was exactly what he needed. The stark landscape of the worksite mirrored Peter's emotional state when he arrived, barren, raw, and waiting to be rebuilt. He threw himself into the work, finding solace in the steady rhythm of progress. Days blurred into weeks, and for a while, that was enough. One evening, as Peter reviewed project budgets in the makeshift office, the door creaked open. A woman entered, carrying a stack of binders and a quiet confidence that seemed to command the room. She was petite, but exuded strength, her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. She glanced at him briefly before setting the binders down. "You must be Peter," she said, her voice calm but direct. "I'm Aliana, the project's financial controller. They said you'd be helping with the oversight." Peter nodded, caught off guard by her presence. "That's right. I'm still getting up to speed." "Good," she replied, flipping open one of the binders. "Because these budgets are a mess." Her bluntness startled him, but it also made him smile for the first time in what felt like months. "Well," he said, meeting her gaze, "then I guess we have some work to do." Over the following weeks, Peter and Eliana worked side by side, their professional collaboration gradually giving way to casual conversations. She had a sharp wit and a dry sense of humor that often caught him off guard. Despite her reserved nature, Peter found himself drawn to her quiet strength. One evening, as they sat in the office finishing paperwork, Aliana broke the comfortable silence. "You're not like most people who come here," she said, glancing at him over her glasses. Peter raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Most people come here to run away from something," she said matter-of-factly. "But you're here to rebuild." Her words struck a chord. Peter hesitated before replying, his voice softer now. "Maybe a little of both." Aliana nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Rebuilding takes courage." Their conversations became more personal over time. Aliana shared stories about her daughter, a spirited 10-year-old named Petra, who was her world. She talked about the challenges of being a single mother, of juggling work and family in a place so far from home. Peter, in turn, opened up about his children and the struggles he had faced in the wake of his divorce. One evening, as they walked back from the work site under the fading glow of the sunset, Aliana asked, "Do you miss them? Your kids?" "Every day," Peter replied without hesitation. "But I needed this time, for myself, to figure out who I am without all the noise." She nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "They'll see that, and when you're ready, they'll see the man you've become." As weeks turned into months, Peter began to notice a shift within himself. The wounds left by Victoria's betrayal no longer consumed him. Instead, they became part of his story, scars that reminded him of his resilience. And as he spent more time with Aliana, he felt something else, a tentative hope, a flicker of trust that he hadn't thought possible. One evening, after a long day, Aliana invited Peter to dinner at her home. The cozy space was filled with the aroma of spices and laughter as Petra greeted him with an exuberant hug. Over the meal, they shared stories and jokes, the warmth of the evening seeping into Peter's heart. "You're good with her," Aliana said softly as she watched Peter help Petra with a puzzle after dinner. "She reminds me of my youngest," Peter replied, a bittersweet smile crossing his face. "It's nice to feel that again." That night, as Peter walked home, he found himself reflecting on how far he had come. The darkness that once consumed him had given way to something brighter. He realized he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, rebuilding, and learning to trust again. Realizing this, Peter told himself that he was prepared to overcome his traumatic experiences, and he did. Aliana had shown him that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about finding the strength to move forward. For the first time in a long time, Peter felt like he was truly ready to do just that. The envelope arrived on an unassuming Tuesday afternoon, tucked into the stack of mail on Peter's desk. The handwriting was unmistakable, Victoria's neat, deliberate script. He stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to open it at all. Part of him wanted to toss it in the trash without a second thought, but curiosity and closure urged him forward. Unfolding the letter, Peter braced himself for the words inside. "Peter," it began, "I know this letter will never undo the pain I've caused you, but I need to say this. I'm sorry, truly and deeply sorry. I let my greed and fear consume me, and in the process, I destroyed the most important things in my life, our family, your trust, and the love we once shared." Peter's jaw tightened as he read on. "There's no excuse for what I did. Kevin may have manipulated me, but I made my own choices, and I have to live with them every day. I hope you find happiness again, Peter, even if it's not with me. You deserve that much." The letter ended with a simple plea. "If you can, please forgive me. If not, I understand. Just know that I am sorry." Peter folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. He didn't feel anger or satisfaction, only a quiet, heavy sadness. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't something he could offer, at least not now. Victoria's words might have been sincere, but they came too late. His life had already moved on, and revisiting that pain would serve no purpose. Without a word, Peter slipped the letter into a drawer and never looked at it again. A blended family. Months later, Peter found himself standing in Aliana's kitchen, watching Petra and Chloe laugh as they mixed batter for cookies. Flour dusted the counter and their faces, and their giggles filled the space with a warmth Peter hadn't realized he'd been missing. Aliana entered the room carrying plates for dinner and paused to take in the scene. "They're trouble together," she said with a smile, nudging Peter gently, "but it's good trouble." Peter nodded, his heart full. The best kind. The transition to blending their families had been smoother than Peter expected. Chloe and Petra had become fast friends, their shared love for puzzles and crafts forging an instant bond. Ethan, though more reserved, had found a quiet camaraderie with Aliana, who encouraged his interest in engineering with gentle enthusiasm. Even Sarah, who had been skeptical at first, warmed to Aliana's steady presence and genuine kindness. One evening, as they sat around the table for dinner, Sarah looked at Peter. "You seem different," she said, her tone thoughtful. "Happier." Peter met her gaze, his voice soft but sure. "Because I am." The love that blossomed between Peter and Aliana wasn't rushed or dramatic. It was steady and unshakable, built on mutual respect and understanding. They didn't erase their pasts, but embraced them, knowing that every scar and story had brought them to this moment. One afternoon, as Peter helped Petra fix the wheels on her bike, she looked up at him and asked, "Do you think we'll ever be like a real family?" Peter knelt down, meeting her curious gaze. "We already are," he said, his voice filled with certainty. The years of betrayal and pain no longer felt like an open wound but a distant memory. Peter's life wasn't perfect, but it was his again, filled with laughter, love, and the kind of peace he thought he'd never find. As the sun set on another day, Peter stood in the yard with Aliana, watching the kids play. He reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I never thought I'd get here," he admitted, his voice low, "but I'm glad I did." Aliana smiled, leaning into him. "So am I." Together, they watched their family grow, each moment a testament to resilience, love, and the power of starting over.